Welcome back to Bring It Home, the show about reindustrialization, the manufacturing renaissance, and reshoring critical industries back in the U.S. I'm your host, JP Hampstead. Got a great show lined up for you today with Charles Yang, a really smart policy thinker in D.C. who has written for the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook. He has an organization that works with politicians from both sides of the aisle to reach consensuses about industrial strategy and the kinds of sectors that the United States should be making like a national priority. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. First, we've got some headlines to discuss. Global Foundries announces a $16 billion investment in semiconductor manufacturing across New York and Vermont. The CEO said that this was a strategic response to explosive growth in artificial intelligence. So yet another one of the world's major semiconductor manufacturing companies committing multiple billions of dollars to construction in the U.S. A great story. Kraft Heinz confirmed its $3 billion investment in U.S. manufacturing, including a $400 million distribution center in DeKalb, Illinois. This investment is expected to create a total of 3,500 U.S. jobs. We've seen several food manufacturers kind of bring in production of different parts of their supply chain into the U.S., partially due to tariff responses. And I think also just, the evolving food, market, the need to bring production close to the end consumer and things like that. So cool to see that from Kraft Heinz. Smaller, but notable and interesting announcement from Rolls-Royce, which of course doesn't, just make fancy cars, but also makes very powerful engines for aircraft and ships and other kinds of power equipment. They are announcing a $24 million investment in U.S. manufacturing to double the production of backup power generators for data centers. So it seems to be another sort of example of how the explosively growing power needs of artificial intelligence is driving investment in manufacturing in the United States. Very cool to see. And I think that does it for our headlines for right now. So in a minute, we'll go to our guests.
Welcome back to the Scenic City, everybody. It's time for the Future of Freight Festival 2025 edition. And this year, we've got some surprises up our sleeve. You're going to join us in Chattanooga at the end of October. We're still going to have everything you love about F3, the speakers, the fun, the incredible atmosphere. But this year, we're dropping you in the heart of Chattanooga. We're taking you to the historic Chattanooga Choo Choo. We're going to have our live music at the Signal this year once again. We're going to give you the experience that you can only get from a FreightWaves event. Go to live.freightwaves.com, get your tickets. We'll see you in October. You don't want to miss it.
All right, our guest today is Charles Yang, the founder of the Center for Industrial Strategy. He's also a contributor to a new document that's been released called the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook. Charles, how are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. First, I want to talk a little bit about the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook. A lot of the people I've talked to for this show, including Julius Krein, Aaron Slodov, they were contributors to it. I want to ask you, Charles, how you got involved in this project, which involves so many different people. What is this emerging scene or movement like, and how did you join?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's certainly a growing number of folks here in DC who are interested in the exact topic that you all are talking about around bringing manufacturing back to the US. And so part of my work when I was at the Department of Energy was directly supporting that work, including both for critical mineral processing, but also broadly for using government tools to support American manufacturing. So it's a small community of us who I think kind of all were excited when the idea for this techno-industrial playbook was coming together, especially given that it was kind of a community-driven playbook with a lot of different contributors.
And so you said there's a lot of people sort of, buying into the reindustrialization movement in Washington, D.C. Are there like forums and institutions in D.C. That sort of cultivate this emerging bipartisan consensus?
I think there could certainly be more, and that's part of the work that I'm doing in standing up this new Center for Industrial Strategies, trying to build these kind of bipartisan convenings where policymakers can come together and actually think through how we actually address this problem in a bipartisan fashion. There's certainly, reindustrialize in Detroit, which I know you mentioned, Aaron and Julius's work. But I think there's really a lot more that we can do. And you see a lot of other groups in the policy space are starting to do their own sort of events and convenings. I think that's something that this movement certainly needs as well.
Great. I want to talk about the playbook itself now. I mean, it's full of these, short, to the point, like practical essays that identify critical problems, whether they're in, frontier science or national security, and then they offer a solution, citations and things like that. It's super interesting. I mean, there's everything from, sort of topics that you would expect, like, okay, we need more funding for vocational training in manufacturing, things like that, rebuilding an industrial workforce, to like novel concepts that I hadn't really heard before, like the idea that acquiring foreign proprietary data sets for the purposes of AI training should be like part of our trade policy, which I found really interesting. Charles, you wrote about critical minerals and kind of how to think about onshoring, especially the sort of processing and refining capacity for those minerals. A lot of people think that the U.S. simply like doesn't have those, or they're sort of confused about how China has established such a lead in these critical minerals. And I would like you to kind of explain how this problem developed over the past decades.
Yeah. And so we focus on processing and refining because that is kind of the one thing that countries sort of have leverage and optionality over, right? Where natural deposits are formed is somewhat outside of our control. And when you look at China's grip on the critical mineral industry, it's really strongest at the processing bottleneck. Most of the times they're actually sourcing ores and feedstock from mines across the country, but they have created a central hub around processing for a ton of different critical minerals, be it from graphite, or nickel, or rare earths. And now there has been kind of this long-term concerted effort from the Chinese government to onshore these kind of critical mineral processing capabilities over the past several decades. And we've seen actually a lot of critical mineral processing in the U.S. even leave the country. A good example is kind of some of the rare earth processing that we used to do here that has subsequently moved over mostly to China. And so the piece that I wrote is coming up with kind of more creative ways of using policy tools and financing tools on the government end to help support critical mineral processing here in the U.S. to counter that.
And so it seemed like one of the problems affecting the United States' ability to process and refine these minerals is that China's like generous subsidies to its domestic processors has sort of like dramatically created like price volatility, or like lowered the price of many of these minerals, and such that someone who perhaps wanted to stand up a refinery in the United States, there's no guarantee that they would be able to like essentially make a positive yield or make any kind of profit on the sales of those refined minerals. Is that the case? And can you talk a little bit about sort of how these markets work?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot of aspects to this that the Chinese government has played in, not just on the subsidy side, but also when you look at kind of IP rights for critical minerals. And another part is economies of scale, right? They're able to build these facilities at a much larger scale than we have here in the US, and as a result, achieve kind of lower costs. I think we're seeing now with the rare earth export controls that are under active discussion now between Trump and the CCP, that this stranglehold is starting to influence not just markets but also broader trade issues between our two countries, right? And so when we look at like all these different factors, then it's going to certainly require a multifaceted effort from the U.S. side to bring that processing back. But the financing is certainly one piece of it, right? Thinking through how can the U.S. government actually support these onshoring of these facilities. The way that we go about doing that, I think, is going to require a lot of different approaches. But this is kind of, I think, biting at least at one piece of that, which is on the like cost side of the capital. Specifically, building these large facilities requires a lot of upfront capital. The government can help at least in that specific aspect with the policy that I walked through, but it's going to require workforce, certainly a tariff strategy, and certainly building an integrated vertical industry that buys these processed outputs and uses them to manufacture rare earth magnets or other kinds of downstream products.
And you mentioned, so in the discussion of like forward contracts or other kinds of contracts where, if the sort of underlying spot price or market price moved against the contract, the government could provide capital to kind of like backstop that difference. You cited an example where I believe Germany has been doing this with hydrogen to kind of move away some of its industrial customers from Russian natural gas. Can you talk a little bit about that and just maybe more broadly about how these contract mechanisms kind of work?
Yeah, so in the critical mineral markets, when a processor and an off-taker sign a contract, it's usually pegged to some index price. And so that index price obviously fluctuates depending on the global supply and demand in the market. One other challenge that I don't just address directly in the piece, but I think listeners might be interested in, is that most of these indice prices are actually tracking out of Chinese-based markets because they are the largest supplier. There is some effort to kind of move away from that. But when these index prices have some degree of volatility, for the buyer, there is some degree of risk that they are taking on, right? Because if the spot price goes too high, then they are suddenly going to be facing that kind of price volatility. And for the seller or the processor, the critical mineral refinery, they are hoping to capture some of that upside. But if prices continue to be depressed, then they're not going to be able to make a profit. Their investors aren't going to give them capital, and they're not going to be able to take off. So the proposal is that the U.S. government should step in and create a kind of backstop against these spot price markets, where the U.S. government will agree if the price drops below a certain floor to help subsidize continued production. And this helps reduce risk for both parties. And that's obviously meant to be kind of a hopeful bridge to commerciality, that as the facility stands up and continues to scale and moves beyond its pilot, that it's going to be able to kind of mature and stand on its own legs. But this is kind of a more efficient way that the government can actually step in and help reduce some of that risk. And it's certainly much more efficient with use of the taxpayer dollar, I would argue, because traditionally grants are just used to like subsidize construction of a facility, right? But we don't really care just about the facility, but what we really care about is kind of an integrated supply chain. And this is directly financing that outcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Making sure that, like a key part of like the commercial viability of any kind of like processor or refiner is, how much does it cost to get its products to its customers. You want to make sure its customers are like domestic and, it's not having to ship things into like a global market, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, Charles, your section about these critical minerals was in sort of a broader piece of the playbook focused on national security. Which minerals do you think are sort of, I guess we can attack this from like two dimensions.
Yeah.
One of them, which minerals are sort of best suited for the kind of policy intervention that you recommend? And then which minerals do you think are like sort of like most critical to national security? What's the sort of intersection of those sets?
Yeah, I think this kind of tool is really best suited for minerals that have like less liquid spot indices, right? So when you have Places like nickel or copper, I mean, these are massive commodity markets. This kind of tool probably wouldn't make sense for these kinds of markets that are already really deep in their capital pools. But probably for smaller ones like rare earths, graphite, potentially lithium, these are markets where spot prices still have a large degree of volatility and are predominantly dominated by Chinese companies, and where there is still some kind of nascent growth in the U.S. that we think could potentially be competitive, right? Especially like with some of the new lithium innovation technologies. To your question about which of these critical minerals is most important when we think about national security, I think it's really, I mean, there's several different layers of this, right? And part of this whole reindustrialization movement is that we have a kind of broader purview of what kinds of economic activities are critical for national security, right? But I would say at the very least, it's going to be minerals where China has like a strong stranglehold on it. Rare earths is certainly one where China essentially dominates almost all of the processing for rare earths today, and where it's a mineral that is like small enough, niche enough that China would be willing to undertake some sort of leveraged action, such as we've seen with rare earths, without overly damaging their economy. So, when it comes to things like nickel, China's control of like Indonesian nickel smelters is certainly kind of a concern. But I think it's a different kind of concern than, for instance, in rare earths, where we've seen they're already willing to take action to cut off U.S. From any supply. So that's kind of one angle to it. But certainly there's going to be a lot of different perspectives when thinking about prioritizing critical minerals. I think the other piece of this is like, which ones can we win in, right? And lithium there, I think, has a potentially strong case. Potentially a few others as well, where there's a lot of innovation that's happening here in the U.S. that we could potentially capitalize on.
That's really helpful. Is there anything else we should hit on about like the sort of the financing of these mineral contracts?
Yeah. I mean, one other tool I just want to highlight that I don't talk about in the piece, but I think is relevant to the ongoing conversation right now is the use of tax credits. And so one tax credit in particular is the 45X Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit. And today it gives a 10% tax credit for the production cost of critical minerals. So any critical mineral production in a country, including processing, can get 10% off on their production cost. I think that's like another example of a really powerful policy tool when we use the tax code to help support these kinds of critical industries. And it's kind of an important one more broadly because it's a tax credit specifically focused on manufacturing production. And so it has kind of a different implementation detail than the kind of a demand side financing that I wrote about because it's a little bit easier to implement in some sense. But that's another, I think, really important policy tool to highlight as well.
And I would imagine that, I've read that bonus depreciation maybe back in the triple B. I know that like our friends in the aviation industry are super excited about that. It really stimulated like sales and just like fleet replenishments and things like that. But I think this time it also applies to just like manufacturing facilities in general.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think so, and I think that's we're talking about a few different tools here, but there's really an entire capital stack, right? That the government has a set of tools, be it tax credits, be it grants, be it loans, be it tariffs, right? There's an entire like set of tools here to kind of align with the outcomes that we want to see, and it's that's kind of the industrial strategy work that we are trying to do, as well as how to craft a kind of architecture for how to think about all these different levers in combination rather than just independently.
Before we turn to your work with the Center for Industrial Strategy, Charles, maybe for the audience here, you could just recommend some of the most interesting pieces from the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook that you found, kind of like most fascinating or surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I know Brian Potter and Austin Vernon, I believe, have a piece on shipbuilding that's certainly timely given the interest in shipbuilding these days. I know Arnab Dada at Institute for Progress also has a separate critical mineral piece that I think is also kind of has a different set of tools, but is certainly also relevant. I think these are the kinds of like hard industries are the ones that at least I'm personally the most interested in. That I think have a lot of great ideas coming out of the playbook from.
Awesome. Well, let's turn to the Center for Industrial Strategy, Charles. What motivated you to start this organization? What's the mission, and what have you guys been up
Yeah.
to?
Yeah, so I kind of really see it as we have this new movement of folks that are interested in supporting manufacturing and an more expansive role of the state in supporting these kinds of critical industries. But I didn't see anyone that was kind of directly focused on that work. There are certainly many people who are interested in it, are working at it from different angles, but there was no one institution, one kind of place for people who were kind of aligned with that mission. And especially in a bipartisan way. I think that's one of the core convictions is that if this is to succeed, it has to be bipartisan. If this becomes kind of partisanly tinted, I don't think it's going to work, frankly, because we're just going to go bouncing back and forth just like every other kind of partisan policy issue. So that was kind of the motivation, is standing up a kind of a new institution that is suited for the moment that we're in, that's able to kind of bring people together who are kind of like-minded on this issue from both sides of the aisle here in DC.
I noticed, at least perhaps in the first Trump administration, there was a bit of a horseshoe theory confirmation where some Democrats from the left that you wouldn't expect to be allies of the president, supported the idea of tariffs and protecting American workers, perhaps for slightly different reasons than the Republicans did. How has the bipartisan consensus on reindustrialization evolved since the first Trump administration? What kind of conversations are you having today?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's still actively evolving, right? I mean, the Biden administration certainly did a lot of things as well. There's the Chips and Science Act that was passed on a bipartisan basis that I think still has a strong degree of support. Biden administration also continued the use of tariffs that the first Trump administration introduced. I think the challenge on the left is, that Biden lost or Harris lost the election, and now a lot of folks are rethinking, was all that stuff that we did worth it? Should the Democratic Party continue to support that kind of policy making? I think that's still an active discussion, and one that I think we need more voices on the left that are like understanding the need for this kind of work, especially when it comes to competing against China, right? And then on the right, I think there's certainly a lot of interest from this administration, right? I think it still remains to be seen the execution of these ideas and kind of how that pans out. And whether for this administration, the Democrat Party kind of reverse polarizes itself against some of this work, right? So I think there's still a lot of shifting ground, and it's still somewhat early days to me in terms of if we're able to actually build this kind of bipartisan consensus in such a polarized time.
And I know that obviously there are different stories we can tell about the recent history of the two parties. On the one hand, it seems like in the 1990s and 2000s, especially, the Democrats worked very hard to enable like the rise of China. On the other hand, during the same period, the Republicans were pursuing lots of insane wars. And I just wonder, how far apart are they with regard to like China? Great power competition. Do the Democrats take sort of the national security challenges or threats even like seriously? And sort of what's the temperature from your perspective there?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, great power competition is really the driving motivation, right, for a lot of this industrial policy work. And I think there is, if on any topic, this is probably the closest that we're going to get on bipartisan consensus. But I think there is still a discrepancy in kind of perception in how people think about China and what competition with it means. And I think, frankly, a lot of people on the left are at the very least not as, I guess, passionate or focused on it as kind of a core issue. Which I think sort of makes sense when you think about the politics, the domestic politics and everything that's happening there, right? There's a lot of issues today that both parties are kind of focused on. But I do think that the issue salience, I guess, is one that continues to kind of fluctuate in different circles, and one that I think we want to continue to bang the drum on as something that like this is an important national focus that should be something both parties are thinking about.
And Charles, your organization, the Center for Industrial Strategy, what kind of activity do you guys get up to? Are you publishing white papers? Are you trying to knocking on the doors of Congress people and trying, leaning in and trying to like persuade them to vote a certain way? on behalf of certain industries. I'm just kind of curious
Yeah.
what it looks like where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, it's certainly early days. We're a couple months into this, but in the spirit of building this bipartisan coalition, we've been doing a lot of things jointly. So we've been doing a joint dinner series, for instance, on industrial policy with American Affairs Journal. We've been doing an archival research project actually on Admiral Hyman Rickover, who's the father of the nuclear navy, and is kind of the reason we have nuclear submarines and nuclear energy today, both of which are obviously of great interest. And so we're trying to revive the spirit of Rickover and how he managed these massive infrastructure projects successfully for so much of his career. Another thread that's gotten a lot of traction is we're doing some joint work on the role of economic development and the role of states and regions in industrial policy, right? I think a lot of folks are focused a lot on DC, the Beltway and the federal government. But if we're actually able to pull this off, it's going to require, the entire country, right? It's going to require states and municipalities and different economic development agencies that are working together on this. And so that's kind of another active line of work that we've been convening and talking with different regions who are interested in thinking about their role in this conversation as well. So that's just kind of an initial slate of some of the projects that we're working on. I think to one of our some of the earlier conversation we had, we are very interested in doing a potential DC conference around industrial policy because I think that's kind of been another missing spot in the ecosystem of actually bringing folks who are interested in this together in a bipartisan fashion to talk about some of the key issues that Congress is certainly thinking about this session and the administration is as well.
That sounds amazing. I'm tickled that you mentioned Admiral Hyman Rickover. I'm related to a couple of aircraft carrier guys. My dad was on an Essex class carrier in the Vietnam War, and my brother-in-law, of course, was on a Nimitz class. He was a nuke during the Global War on Terror. So I want to hear all about this research on Hyman Rickover. I mean, it sounds like this is like sort of a, I don't know, like a sort of a military industrial Cold War project to build like small nuclear reactors and operate them. But I'm curious to hear like sort of to get a preview from you about what that archival research looks like and what sorts of lessons you hope to learn from that project.
Yeah, well, it's awesome that the legacy of Rickover is even living on in your family. Our interest is, he was a very unique guy. If you just hear any kind of story about him, and we think that kind of strong technical leadership within the government to build large infrastructure projects is missing today. And so the project we're doing is the Rickover estate made all of his files publicly available at the U.S. Naval Academy archives like a year, maybe 2 years ago. And no one has kind of seen them since the original biographers and researchers were using it. And so we are digitizing a large part of the publicly available speeches and manuscripts that Rickover wrote or gave that have never been digitized before. And so stay tuned. In the next, I think, couple of weeks, we're hoping to do our first drop of digitized speeches. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff in there. He certainly had a wide-ranging set of opinions and interests when thinking about what is necessary for the U.S. government to compete with Russia back then during the Cold War. And I think it's certainly going to be relevant today as well.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. Nice. And without naming any names in a way that you're uncomfortable with, who have you found to be some of the strongest voices in DC for reindustrialization? Who were the sorts of most receptive audience members for the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook?
Yeah. Well, I'll certainly say, I just think one person that I admire is like Senator Todd Young, from Indiana, who's been kind of a leader on a lot of the industrial legislation that's come out of Congress. I think he's also been a good bipartisan figure. Working on the Chips and Science Act with parts of the Democrat Party, I think was really commendable. And he's someone who's, I think, very serious thinker about what it's required to do this. But more broadly, I think the Techno-Industrial Playbook has certainly gotten a lot of reception on both sides of the aisle. I know some of the sponsors of the project mailed a copy to every single congressional office. And I think we're hoping to see a little bit some more uptake of these ideas within the administration and also legislation side.
Awesome. Todd Young. And anyone from the Democrats that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of folks coming out of the Biden administration who I think are recognizing both the value of industrial policy and also some of the mistakes or lessons learned, at least from the previous administration. I think at least Brian Deese's most recent foreign affairs article, I think, was an appropriate recognition and kind of had the it's time to build ethos. And it's notable to hear that coming from someone who was so senior in the Biden administration. And also, if you read the article, there's some I think, reflections on what were the mistakes or things that held back the Biden administration from going as far as they would have liked on some of this industrial policy work. So I think it still remains to be seen, though, kind of what the takeaways, for the Democrat side is on a lot of this industrial policy work, and that's a part of the conversation that we're also hoping to be active in.
Yeah, it seemed like, from my perspective, like the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act as well were like a great sort of step forward in terms of changing the kind of conversation and showing basically putting skin in the game in terms of deciding, hey, this is a national priority, we need to build in these certain industries. Perhaps some of the shortcomings were the selection of certain sort of subsectors or sectors to massively stimulate. I don't know exactly how you feel about solar energy, for example, but I don't know if that was necessarily the most critical or most productive thing to focus on. And another shortcoming that I've often heard people mention is that it was sort of these one-time grants for different companies rather than the construction of, for example, financing mechanisms that could sort of alter the whole kind of market and provide more sort of long-lasting incentives. Is that your take, or am I thinking about this wrong?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two things there. I think first, the value of the CHIPS and Science Act, or kind of the strength of it, is that it was a very clear, sectorally focused bill that was passed on a bipartisan basis and through regular order of Congress, not through kind of a reconciliation process. And there was a clear consensus on why this industry mattered and what the case for success looked like, namely getting every single semiconductor company with a leading edge capability to build a facility here in the U.S. And it has, as of right now, still accomplished that goal. Every single, all 4 or 5 of these large semiconductor companies have facilities now in the U.S., which is kind of historic. There's no other country that has that capability. And I think that is, to me, the kind of the template for future successful legislation, right? In shipbuilding or in critical minerals, these kind of sectoral focused bills where there's a clear bipartisan consensus on what needs to be done and why this matters, and then going about and passing that sort of legislation. But I think to your point, the challenge is there's, the administration always has to implement these bills, and there was some controversy around that with the CHIPS and Science Act. And there also needs to be kind of investor confidence, market confidence that these policies will last, right? And I think we're seeing that right now happen through Congress, where a lot of the policies that were passed under the Biden administration are now being kind of reconsidered, possibly repealed under a Republican Congress. I think that that dynamic is damaging when we think about the market's ability to trust U.S. legislation and U.S. policymaking in the long term. And that's why we're so focused on building sort of a bipartisan consensus and identifying key industries that everyone can agree on, right? To your point, not just specific ones that one party or the other might like. Because if we kind of keep doing this, the market is just going to start ignoring U.S. policymaking. And I think that would be kind of the worst case outcome.
That makes a lot of sense. Basically, the way that these bills are passed is almost just as important as what's in them, in the sense of making sure that they have sort of political durability, and that, like you said, capital allocators can make decisions based on them with confidence, knowing that they can start projects that have, may take many years to pay off, but there will be a kind of a stability to the regulatory and policy regime.
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right. I mean, it's not just the way what's in the bill, but the way that it's passed is, I think, a really succinct way of kind of what I was trying to communicate.
Charles, thanks so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and we will be looking forward to releases and announcements from the Center for Industrial Strategy.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Well, that does it for this episode of Bring It Home. Be sure to visit our website at bringithome.us, where you can see articles, newsletters, all of our recent episodes. Follow us on X. And we also have a YouTube channel. You can find our podcast on any of the major podcast players, including Apple, Spotify, etc. So until next time, enjoy.